Yeah, so I think we'll get started. We're going to start with our half-hour workshop, after which we'll start the regular meeting. And so for workshop subject matter, we've got two things. Natalie, our city planner, is going to share an update on the parking local law, just kind of where the city is with that. And then, we're going to talk a little bit about this concept of lot subdivision internal lots, just to kind of get a general sense of what that is, what it means, so on and so forth. So thank you, Natalie.
Yeah, so we can start with an update on the parking local law. So as the board's familiar, the city is considering adopting parking maximums rather than parking minimums as a means to reduce kind of the over parking of vehicles, reduce the amount of asphalt that has to be built for projects, and better facilitate kind of affordable housing and more affordable development. So where that's at, it's been in front of the city council a few times with public hearings as well. I think the last workshop with the with the city council, there was requests, and I think following up from comments from the planning board about how to give the planning board more guidance. So if we're going to remove the minimums and do maximums, rather than just relying on applicants, consultants to kind of present what they think is feasible for the project, what are some other ways that we can help guide the planning board? So the city council has also engaged the Creighton Manning, the traffic engineer, to kind of help. So right now, myself and the Creighton Manning team are kind of looking at opportunities for maybe, if we're thinking about parking broken up into three buckets, right? Main Street, the more residential areas of the neighborhood, and then maybe commercial areas outside of Main Street, and kind of thinking about different regulations for those three areas based on their needs. So there's no revised local law yet. We're aiming to get that for the city council's next meeting. And we're investigating potentially putting in some minimums, reduced minimums, but putting back in some minimums for some of those areas where appropriate. And then also investigating the city council had a desire to think about parking fee in lieu of. So if an applicant is not going to be providing parking on site that is deemed necessary, and maybe they're going to be utilizing a municipal lot nearby, how can they be paying into a fund that can help kind of maintain that lot and potentially improve parking with lighting and other facilities? So we anticipate having the next public hearing on the item is next Monday. The city council's meeting on Monday is the next scheduled public hearing, so the council will be hearing comments, and then we're aiming to get them a revised draft in 2 weeks before their next meeting.
So the next public hearing is not on a revised draft?
It's not on a revised draft. They set that at the last, they adjourned the last public hearing to this date, so they'll be getting any kind of additional comments that weren't able to be made at previous public hearings, and then discussing the revised draft at their next workshop.
Great, thanks. Curious, don't we already have a provision on payment in lieu of?
I believe it was removed, and I think Jennifer just walked out because we were talking about that with Keenan Bean. So there used to be a parking fee in lieu of, and I don't know all the history about it, but at some point that was eliminated. So I think the conversation is bringing it back and making it more updated in terms of, pricing for today.
Yeah. What about meters? I haven't heard much on the subject, just in terms of
parking meters and whether that's. I think that's part of the conversation as well, because it's part of parking management, right? If you are going to be removing parking minimums or lowering them to have, efficient turnover. I think right now the city utilizes time limits for that turnover, but meters and pricing can be utilized to also kind of direct people with cheaper parking to areas that maybe aren't as utilized, right? So you're spreading that out. I don't know if that's going to be a part of this conversation, but I think it's in the traffic consultant's mind that if we do something with parking maximums or minimums now, thinking about meters down the line. But I don't think that's necessarily being brought into the conversation quite yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I know the signed limits are around cleaning, not necessarily. And there are actually some where you've got 2 hours.
2 hours or 1 hour, yeah.
But it's limited.
Whether they're enforced, and, I think that really impacts the turnover rate. And so I think you're absolutely right that parking meters and payment for on-street parking is how you can kind of encourage folks not to park their car and leave it there for multiple days on Main Street or in areas where you're seeing high utilization. So that's definitely something we're discussing, but might not be made part of this.
So it's evolving.
Yeah, it's
Yep.
evolving.
Yep, no, this concept of looking at different parking regulations for different parts of the city
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, because the needs and the demand aren't the same everywhere.
Yeah.
So I think looking at maybe breaking those regulations up a little bit to give the board more guidance when they're reviewing applications in different areas of the city.
And they actually did take some of our advice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. So, yeah, I'll be curious to see what comes back just in terms of what you mentioned about guidance. I think that's one of the more important things, especially for us when we're reviewing applications.
Yeah.
So that will be helpful.
absolutely.
Any questions on that subject around the board?
No, I'm encouraged that they're working on all those issues that some people brought up, and I think it's really helped. It's been a healthy conversation for them, to what I've heard. So,
Yeah,
Yeah, I'll be definitely interested to see the updated proposed law.
great.
Great. Anything else on that subject? No?
Great. So the second topic we wanted to talk about for the training, to just give a little bit of background, is on this section for internal property subdivisions. It's appropriate for now because I think we do have a project before the board that is utilizing this section of the code. But I think in general, we just wanted to take a step back and talk about the purpose of this section, why it gets used by developers, and what the benefit is to the city of Beacon. So the internal property subdivision is kind of what you're seeing is when there is a large development that is either going to be phased or have multiple buildings. What we see often once they get to the point of construction is developers wanting to come back to do an internal subdivision on the parcel to kind of put different buildings in different phases on separate lots, right? And the provision in the code, which is section 223-25, section C, allows for them to draw these new kind of internal lot lines and not necessarily apply all the other kind of setback requirements and things that you would often see with separate properties. And why a developer would utilize this is it really comes down to financing projects. So especially for these larger projects, when you're going to have various commercial tenants or you're going to have phased development that requires financing at different times, lenders are often opposed to putting up one mortgage note on the entire parcel, and then a developer is often unable to cover kind of the equity that would need to go in to cover a mortgage of that size for a full project like that. You often see it utilized too with commercial buildings, because often a commercial tenant will need to take out their own loans in order to do fit up of the space, and a lender for that commercial tenant is not going to want to be the second note or the second mortgage on a property. They're going to want to be the first mortgage on that property. So developers are often using this to kind of break up the project so they can each be financed. And some examples of this, right, like the Galleria was one of the ones where there was a lot of different parcels put in place for each of the tenants. Macy's had one, Sears had one. They each had their own parcel, and that's so that those commercial tenants can take out their own loan and they're not subject to the liability of the other tenants on site, is so what you often see. And then, I think for developments that have mostly residential units with some commercial space, again, it's this balance between cash flow coming out, especially if it's a phased project, right? You want to kind of have cash flow coming in from the projects that are being constructed and built before you take out the full mortgage or construction loan on the later phases. And so, the benefit to this is projects can be built, right? I think right now in the current kind of lending climate with really competitive lending operations out there and high interest rates, it is difficult or impossible for most developers to get a a loan that would cover the entire construction of a project. So I think what this helps in the city is that the project this planning board reviews can actually be built, right? So that you're not seeing projects stall out partway through where they can only finance a certain portion of the project and then they can't build as quickly as they've promised to kind of get new housing units or new commercial spaces online. So I think that's one of the big benefits. It's also easier to support commercial tenants who, sometimes, especially like restaurants is the example I like to use, it can often cost, depending on the size of a restaurant facility, it can cost anywhere from like $500,000 to $1 million to build out a kitchen for a commercial level kitchen. And most restaurateurs, especially if they're kind of not big chains or not nationals, can't front that money. So they're going to need their own construction loan to do that fit up of that space. And that's where this kind of more flexible financing allows them to take out their own loans for these developments. And then also with financing institutions like the Industrial Development Agency, right, IDAs or anything, I think breaking up these projects into different parcels and different pieces allows institutions like that to only finance the pieces that align with their mission, right? So IDAs often are trying to finance or support job creation, commercial spaces. And so by breaking up the projects with these subdivisions, they can kind of target areas that are either mixed use or commercial that they're allowed to finance. Yeah, so that's the general overview. So I think, the summary of it is these are really, there's a lot of technical things that I'm sure John could jump in on in terms of like what happens when you draw a line on a parcel to make it its own parcel in terms of utilities and things like that. But I think, how this functions is it really is a site and it allows the site to still be managed by one entity, all the shared spaces, parking, open space. It allows it to still be managed by one entity while allowing different financing options for each of the separate pieces.
Yeah, this is really helpful. I mean,
Good.
just understanding the idea of, this concept of encumbrance, right? And what it means in terms of the financing, especially lenders wanting to make sure that they're not subject to a lien as subject to, some other aspect of the property. They're free and clear on their own parcel, if you will.
Yes.
I'm just curious, because this hasn't come up often. It most recently came up on hip lofts. Mm-hmm. And the concept is clear. Just after our approval, do these become separate tax lots filed with Dutchess County, like a typical subdivision? Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, so the way this code, different municipalities do it differently, but the way this code is written, they're subdivided, so they become their own fee simple lot.
So these subdivisions then carry, meaning unless someone comes back to subdivide again in a different manner,
Or to
with a
merge,
different
or
application.
to,
Right, exactly.
yeah, at some point, if once the loan or once the financing is no longer kind of being paid off, then I guess they would have the opportunity to merge them
Yeah.
back together as
So
a
they
single.
act just like a regular subdivision application, right? And they're subject to all of the reviews, easements, utilities, right? They have to,
The only thing they're not subject to because of your code is like the setback requirements and things like that. Like often you would have to have a buildings, so there is some, I'd say waiver of those requirements, but they still do have to do easements for the utilities and the shared spaces, which is I think what we talked about for the last project.
this is helpful. Anything you wanted to add?
No, I mean, it does bring up some information or some concerns with utilities sometimes, as we'll discuss later on one of the applications. With regards to water and sewer, it may require the formation of a transportation corporation to handle those utilities, where they were private before, but since they're crossing multiple lots, Department of Health frowns upon HOAs owning them. The DEC will not allow that to occur. So it's usually the Department of Health looking for the utilities to be dedicated to the municipality or transportation corporation to be formed.
And the transportation corporation is just like an agreement showing that the different owners of these different lots have to collaborate on the maintenance and of those utilities, right?
They take joint ownership and responsibility.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Did you have something? Is that David?
Well, basically the big picture risk, let's say, is that a project's not going to get completed. The risk of going from where we're current at having it
Your microphone.
to having it be subdivided, what do we do to protect against that risk?
Sorry, say that again?
What do we do to protect against that risk, that the project doesn't get completed for whatever reason, and that gets facilitated by the subdivision because the whole thing's not hanging on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why the city council adopted this legislation, right? To allow this to happen more easily, because it is becoming more and more common practice as we start to see mixed-use development, as we start to see kind of phased development, as we see the higher cost of construction. So it is becoming more, so I think that's why this was adopted in the first place, is that it just creates an avenue for this to be done. I don't think there's anything you could do to demand that an applicant take advantage of this, but they're obviously they're going to want to make sure their project goes forward and that it doesn't stall out. So if they have this opportunity, that's why it was created.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Are you asking the corollary of the question, or were you asking like, well, if you subdivide it, so let's say that the process to subdivide goes forward, and then for some reason, they're still unable to complete all the financing. Does that create some additional headache now where they're on separate parcels and perhaps some of the parcels get sold to another? Is that possible? And does that create any headaches or any downstream kind of?
It's still all bound by the approved site plan. So even though the project site is divided into different parcels, they're still all subject to the approved site plan, which takes into consideration the project as a whole and the project site as a whole. So even if, say one of the parcels, they get their financing, but they default, right? And the bank takes over one of the parcels. That bank is still subject to the declaration of restrictive covenants that's in place as a deed restriction against the parcel, which requires them to, there's access easements, there's maintenance agreements with respect to all the infrastructure, and it's still viewed as a project site as a whole until someone comes in to amend that subdivision or propose a new project. At that point, we'd have to deal with
Because of
the
the
ownership
access
issue.
agreements and easements, that bank or new owner wouldn't be able to say, oh, I suddenly need a new road, or I
No.
need a new parking lot.
They'd have to
Because
come
that's-
for a full review on that whole
Absolutely.
application, and they more than likely need to have any other sub-owners agree to this. To some degree, this idea of interior lots is it's sort of a disincentivization for anyone to come in and think that that's a great prospect for, because it's really not what I would consider a valuable lot, right? So if your question is more around, like a traditional subdivision of, say 20 acres into, 1 acre lots, there's really an incentive there for, right, an avenue for profit on sale. But this, it's a very different kind of product, if you will.
Look, let me take a step back and just phrase it this way. What are the considerations, the concerns we should be having with these internal subdivision applications? Obviously, we have 2 on the agenda tonight.
I think what's in the code for the planning board to be considering is the kind of maintenance of the shared common spaces and making sure that the easements and agreements are in place. That's what's in the code for the planning board to be thinking about, and so that's what was in my last planning review letter for these projects, is to be looking at, okay, so you had this overall site plan that was approved for this, and with this subdivision plan, is everybody still going to be getting access to the amenities, to the parking, to the open space that was originally considered as part of that site plan layout? I think that's the biggest thing that the planning board should be kind of considering, which, gets taken care of a lot through legal easements and agreements, but I think that's something just for the planning board to discuss, is making sure that all the properties are still going to have access to these aspects of the site plan.
So the subdivided properties can be sold off to, to different owners?
I think, yes, they could technically, but to Jennifer's point, I think they would still be subject to you could sell them, but who would buy that knowing that that parcel is subject to all the easement agreements, all the maintenance agreements, the site plan restrictions? Could be, but unlikely that some random third-party property owner would come in and want to be a piece of this. But, I think,
Especially an interior lot.
especially, if you're going to be,
What's the fun there?
You can almost relate it to a condominium association. You're selling your condo, but you're still subject to everything else
Yeah.
within that
That's a good analogy.
association.
Yep.
Yeah.
What are the pros and cons of the sewer maintenance or the city taking, you know,
Whether it's a transportation corporation or whether the city takes ownership.
the city takes ownership, what kind of financial obligations does that put on the city?
Well, it's more sewer main to maintain, but you're getting a whole new system going in typically on these projects, so there's very little maintenance. These people are also already being taxed as far as water and sewer, so they're already paying towards the maintenance as everybody else would on any other road.
I think the pro is that the city then has access over this, because it's tied into the city system most often. So if something was to go wrong there, it's often easier if the city has ownership of that, to do the required maintenance to make sure the system is running correctly.
City has the control.
It has the control.
Yep.
As a transportation corporation, they can die eventually. People walk away, whatever else, and then that system would wind up falling to the city anyway. Now, let's say they had it for 5 years. How do we know they've actually properly maintained it, taken care of it? They didn't walk away with a failing system. All of a sudden, the city winds up with it in its lap because that's what the Department of Health is going to require. And now the city's on the hook to fix this whole system.
So there are no inspection requirements at all?
You can use your microphone. Please.
There are no inspection
Well,
requirements then?
that's something that would have to be set up within the Transportation Corporation if that was formed.
And it's not already then?
There's nothing formed right now.
Okay.
Right, so what you're saying is that parcels subject to this kind of thing, where the question is whether it's a transportation organization or city-owned, each one is unique and individual in terms of the requirements placed upon it at review.
Correct.
Right. Cool. We got 5 minutes left. What do we want to talk about?